I found my late husband's watch in my sister-in-law's glove box. He claimed he bought it new. That night, I brought the police. The moment I opened that glove box on a quiet suburban Chicago street, my heart shattered into jagged pieces. There it was, my late husband's watch, the very one he wore every day until the night he died, lying cold and forgotten beside a cracked pack of gum. The silence that swallowed me was deafening. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Helen, and I'm 74 years old. Every morning begins the same way in my small but neat apartment overlooking the gray skyline of Chicago. I wake up wrapped in silence that presses down like a thick fog. The radiator clanks its familiar tune. The coffee maker hisses to life. I take my pills, 3 white ones for blood pressure, a yellow one for my heart, and stare out the window at the city's restless rhythm below. The smell still lingers in our bedroom. His cologne, Old Spice, the same brand he wore for 47 years of marriage. I can almost hear him padding across the hardwood floors in his worn slippers, the way he'd hum while shaving, how he'd laugh at the dumbest jokes on the morning news. George had this watch, a simple silver Timex with a black leather band, that he'd tap against the kitchen counter when he was thinking. Tap, 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 like a clock counting down our moments together. But those warm memories have been overshadowed lately by something much colder. The growing distance from my family, the empty chairs at Sunday dinners, the phone calls that never come, and especially the chill that settles over me whenever I think about my sister-in-law, Rachel. Rachel married my younger brother-in-law 15 years ago. She's one of those women who always seems to know exactly what to say and when to say it. Perfectly styled blonde hair that never moves, even in Chicago wind. Designer handbags that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. She lives in Lincoln Park now, in one of those renovated Victorian houses with the fancy iron gates and manicured lawns. After George died 18 months ago, Rachel appointed herself as the family coordinator. Helen needs structure, she'd tell my children. Helen needs guidance. As if I were a child who couldn't manage her own life. As if 60 years of marriage, raising 3 kids, and managing a household meant nothing. That particular Wednesday started like any other. I was supposed to have lunch with my daughter Sarah to hear about her new marketing job downtown. We'd planned to meet at that little Italian place on North Clark Street, the one where George and I used to go for anniversaries. I was even wearing the blue dress he always said brought out my eyes. But at 11:30, my phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Sorry, Mom. Have to cancel. Work emergency. Rain check?" No phone call, no apology. Just a cold, dismissive text that made my chest tighten with familiar disappointment. I stared at that message for 10 minutes, watching the words blur through tears I refused to let fall. I called my son Michael instead, straight to voicemail. Then my youngest, David. No answer. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. The silence was suffocating. Something inside me snapped. Instead of sitting there drowning in that familiar rejection, I grabbed my purse and car keys. I was going to drive, just drive and think, and maybe stop by Rachel's house. Maybe she'd have answers about why my own children couldn't find time for their mother. Rachel's house is only 20 minutes from my apartment, but it might as well be on another planet. The tree-lined streets of Lincoln Park with their perfect sidewalks and designer storefronts feel like a world away from my modest neighborhood near Wicker Park. Every house seems to whisper about money and status and the kind of life I never quite achieved. I parked across the street from her house and sat there for a few minutes, feeling foolish. What was I doing? A 74-year-old woman stalking her sister-in-law like some desperate teenager. But something drew me forward. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the need for answers. Maybe it was just the stubborn streak that George always said would get me in trouble someday. Rachel's black BMW sat in the driveway, gleaming under the afternoon sun. The same car I'd helped her buy 3 years ago when she claimed they were having temporary financial difficulties. $5,000 from George's retirement account. Money we could have used for his medical bills. But I'd given it freely because family helps family. That's what I'd always believed. I walked up to the car, not really sure what I was looking for. The driver's side door was unlocked. Typical Rachel, living in her safe little bubble where nothing bad ever happens. I opened the glove compartment, thinking maybe I'd find some clue about where everyone was, why I'd been excluded from whatever was happening in my family's life. Insurance papers, a parking stub from Navy Pier, a cracked pack of spearmint gum. And then I saw it. George's watch. The world tilted. My knees went weak, and I had to grab the car door to keep from falling. There was no mistake. The scratches on the silver bezel where he'd bumped it against the garage door. The worn spots on the leather band from 47 years of daily wear. The tiny inscription on the back that I'd had engraved for our 10th anniversary. Forever yours, H. My hands shook as I lifted it from the compartment. It was real. It was his. But how could it be here? The watch had disappeared from George's belongings right after the funeral. I'd torn the house apart looking for it. It was the one thing, the only thing, I'd wanted to keep. His wedding ring had been buried with him, but this watch held every ordinary moment we'd shared, every morning routine, every shared glance across the breakfast table, every time he'd checked it during our children's baseball games or school plays. I'd asked everyone if they'd seen it. Rachel had looked me straight in the eye and said no. She'd even helped me search through his dresser drawers, making sympathetic noises about how items sometimes get misplaced during stressful times. But 3 weeks later, I'd seen her husband wearing what looked like the exact same watch. When I'd mentioned it, Rachel had laughed. "Oh, that old thing. James bought it at a pawn shop downtown. Said it reminded him of his father's watch. Isn't it sweet how men get sentimental?" I'd felt foolish for even asking. Of course it wasn't George's watch. Of course there was a reasonable explanation. There are thousands of similar timepieces in the world. I was just a grieving widow seeing her dead husband's ghost in every corner. But holding it now, feeling the familiar weight in my palm, reading that inscription in my own handwriting, there was no doubt. This was George's watch. This was my husband's most treasured possession, the one that had vanished from our bedroom while I planned his funeral. The tears came then, hot and bitter, not just for the watch, but for everything it represented. The lies, the betrayal, the realization that while I'd been drowning in grief, someone in my own family had been stealing pieces of the man I'd loved for nearly 5 decades. I sat in Rachel's car holding that watch and remembered every sacrifice I'd made for this family, every unpaid loan, every forgotten birthday, every time I'd swallowed my pride to keep the peace. The pattern stretched back years, maybe decades, and I'd been too blind to see it. Do you know what it feels like to realize you've been played for a fool by the people who are supposed to love you most? Have you ever held proof of betrayal in your hands and felt your whole world shift beneath your feet? I need to tell you about the sacrifices, about the 30 years I spent being the family's safety net, the reliable one, the mother and grandmother who always said yes. Because without understanding that history, you can't truly grasp how deep this betrayal cut. When George and I first married, we lived in a studio apartment above a bakery on the north side. We had nothing but love and determination and the belief that family comes first, always. George worked double shifts at the steel mill while I cleaned houses and took in sewing to make ends meet. We saved every penny we could, dreaming of the day we could buy our own place and start our family. But families have needs, and we were the stable ones. When George's brother lost his job in the 80s, we took out a second mortgage to help him keep his house. When my sister needed money for her daughter's wedding, we dipped into our vacation fund. When Sarah was going through her divorce, we refinanced our home to pay for her legal fees. I kept a mental ledger of every dollar we'd given out over the years. Not because I expected repayment, but because I wanted to remember the good we'd done, the love we'd shared, the way families should support each other through thick and thin. $47,000 to Sarah for her divorce and the down payment on her condo. $18,000 to Michael when his business failed. $22,000 to David for college expenses that his scholarships didn't cover. $15,000 to various relatives for weddings, medical bills, and emergencies that always seemed to coincide with our tax refund checks. And Rachel. Sweet, manipulative Rachel who'd married into our family with her designer clothes and her financial problems that never quite added up. The $5,000 for her car. $8,000 when she and James claimed they were behind on their mortgage. $3,000 for what she called a temporary cash flow issue that would be repaid within the month. That was 2 years ago. George used to joke that we were running a private bank out of our kitchen. The First National Bank of Suckers, he'd say, but always with a smile. Always with the understanding that this was what family did. We helped each other. We sacrificed for the greater good. But the sacrifices weren't just financial. They were emotional too. How many times had I bitten my tongue when Rachel made cutting remarks about my clothes, my cooking, my simple way of life? How many family gatherings had I endured where I felt like an outsider looking in at a life I'd never be sophisticated enough to join? "Helen, you really should consider updating your wardrobe," she'd say with that patronizing smile. "There are ways to look elegant without spending a fortune. I could help you if you'd like." Or when I'd bring my famous potato salad to family barbecues, she'd sigh and say, "Oh, Helen brought the heavy food again. Thank goodness I made that quinoa salad. We need something healthy on the table." Small cuts, each one barely noticeable on its own, but together they formed a pattern of dismissal and disrespect that ate away at my confidence year after year. George would squeeze my hand under the table during these exchanges, a silent reminder that he saw what was happening, that he valued me even if others didn't seem to. After George died, the dynamic shifted. Without my husband there to witness and validate my feelings, Rachel's behavior became bolder. She started speaking for me in conversations, making decisions about family plans without consulting me, treating me like an elderly aunt who needed to be managed rather than the family matriarch I'd always been. "Helen doesn't really like restaurants," she'd tell my children when they suggested meeting for dinner. "She prefers quiet evenings at home." "Helen gets confused by new technology," she'd explain when they talked about video calling or sharing photos online. "It's better to keep things simple." None of it was true. I love trying new restaurants. I'd learned to use a smartphone and even joined Facebook to see pictures of my grandchildren. But Rachel's version of me, the fragile, confused old woman, was easier for everyone to accept than the truth. It gave them permission to exclude me from plans and ignore my opinions because, after all, Helen wouldn't understand anyway. The worst part was watching my own children start to believe her narrative. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Invitations dwindled. When I'd suggest activities or express opinions, I could see them exchange those patient looks that adults save for unreasonable children. "Mom, you worry too much," Michael would say when I expressed concern about family dynamics. "Mom, things are different now," Sarah would sigh when I mentioned feeling left out. "We're all so busy. You understand, right?" No, I didn't understand. I didn't understand how being widowed had suddenly made me invisible, how losing George meant losing my voice in my own family, how the woman who'd raised them, supported them, and loved them unconditionally had become someone to be managed rather than consulted. The day before I found the watch, I'd overheard Rachel on the phone in the grocery store parking lot. I'd gone to pick up ingredients for Sunday dinner, a tradition I was desperately trying to maintain, when I spotted her BMW in the lot. Through her partially open window, I heard her laughing with someone about poor Helen. "She's getting so needy," Rachel was saying, "always wanting to be included in everything. James thinks we should just be honest and tell her that some activities are for the younger generation, you know. But I keep trying to be gentle about it." The person on the other end must have said something funny because Rachel laughed again, that tinkling sound that had once seemed charming, but now felt like ice in my veins. "Oh, you're terrible. But you're not wrong. Sometimes I feel like we're dealing with a child who doesn't understand that not every birthday party is meant for her." I stood frozen beside the shopping carts, groceries forgotten, while my sister-in-law discussed my emotional needs like I was a burden to be managed. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Here was a woman who'd borrowed thousands of dollars from George and me, who'd eaten countless meals at our table, who'd relied on our babysitting services when her own children were small, and she was laughing about my loneliness with someone else. That night I called each of my children, direct questions about family plans, about whether I'd done something to upset someone, about why I felt like I was living on the outside of my own family's life. They were all busy, distracted, offering vague reassurances that everything was fine while clearly wanting to end the conversations as quickly as possible. "Mom, you're overthinking this. David said. Everyone's just got a lot going on right now. But I wasn't overthinking. I was finally starting to see clearly. The systematic exclusion, the financial exploitation, the emotional manipulation. It had been building for years, hidden behind smiles and family loyalty, until George's death left me vulnerable and alone. The morning I found the watch, I'd been planning to confront these feelings head-on. I was tired of being treated like a child, tired of having my emotions dismissed, tired of feeling like a burden to the people I'd spent my life loving. The canceled lunch with Sarah was just the final straw that broke my tolerance for being ignored. But nothing could have prepared me for the betrayal of finding George's watch in Rachel's possession. Sitting in her car that afternoon, holding that familiar weight in my palm, I felt something shift inside me. The woman who'd spent decades smoothing over family conflicts and keeping the peace was disappearing. In her place was someone I barely recognized. Someone angry enough to demand answers, and strong enough to handle the truth, whatever it might be. I slipped the watch into my purse and walked to Rachel's front door. My hands were steady now, my mind clear. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do. She answered the door in yoga pants and a designer top, her perfectly styled hair catching the afternoon light. "Helen, what a surprise! I wasn't expecting you." The smile was bright and fake, the kind she reserved for unexpected visitors who might disrupt her carefully managed day. But I saw something else flicker across her face when she looked at me. Was it guilt? Fear? Or just annoyance at having her afternoon interrupted? "We need to talk," I said, stepping past her into the pristine entryway. The house smelled like expensive candles and fresh flowers, a stark contrast to my apartment with its lingering sense of loneliness and memories. "Of course. Let me just put on some coffee." She was already moving toward the kitchen, clearly hoping to control the conversation by staying busy. "How are you doing? You look tired." There it was, the subtle dig, the implication that I wasn't taking proper care of myself. 6 months ago, I would have deflected with self-deprecating humor or apologized for bothering her. But not today. "I found something in your car," I said quietly, pulling the watch from my purse. "Something that belongs to me." The color drained from Rachel's face so quickly I thought she might faint. She gripped the marble countertop, her knuckles going white. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. "I can explain," she finally whispered. "I'm sure you can." My voice was steady, but inside I was shaking. "You're very good at explanations, like the one about James buying a similar watch at a pawn shop. That was creative." Rachel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The confident, controlling woman who'd been managing my life for the past 18 months was nowhere to be seen. In her place stood someone who looked cornered and desperate. "Helen, please. You don't understand. There were expenses after George died. Medical bills that weren't covered, funeral costs. I was trying to help by stealing his watch." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't regret them. "By lying to my face while I searched for it? By letting your husband wear it like some kind of trophy?" The tears were starting now, but they weren't mine. Rachel was crying, mascara making dark tracks down her cheeks as she struggled to find words that might salvage the situation. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We thought, you have so many memories of him, and we thought one small thing wouldn't matter." "One small thing?" I was standing now, the watch clutched in my fist. This was his most precious possession. He wore it every single day for 47 years. He checked it when you were born, when your children were born, when he walked me down the aisle at our daughter's wedding. And you thought it wouldn't matter? The kitchen fell silent except for Rachel's quiet sobs. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of suburban life continuing. Lawnmowers, children playing, dogs barking. The world was moving forward while mine stood completely still. "Where are the other things?" I asked quietly. Her head snapped up. "What other things?" "Don't." My voice was ice. "Don't make this worse by lying to me again. What else did you take while I was planning my husband's funeral?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Rachel's designer kitchen, with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, felt cold and hostile. This was what my money had helped buy, this perfect, sterile life built on lies and theft. His coin collection, she whispered finally, and some of the tools from the garage. James said you'd never notice, that you don't know about tools anyway. The coin collection, George's pride and joy, carefully assembled over 30 years of marriage. Silver dollars and wheat pennies and commemorative pieces he'd bought for special occasions. He used to spread them out on our kitchen table on rainy Sunday afternoons, telling me the history behind each one while I cooked dinner. I'd looked everywhere for that collection, assuming it had been misplaced during the chaos after his death. What else? My voice was barely a whisper now. His fishing tackle, some of the books, the clock from his workshop. Each admission came harder than the last, pulled from her like physical pain. Helen, please. I know how it looks, but we were going to tell you eventually. We just thought, with everything you were going through, you thought I was too stupid to notice, too grief-stricken to remember what belonged to my own husband. The anger was building now, hot and clean and powerful. How long have you been planning this? How long have you been waiting for George to die so you could pillage our life together? It wasn't like that. Rachel's voice was pitched high with desperation. We never wanted him to die. We loved George too, but after the medical bills and everything, we thought maybe we could help by taking care of some things, preserving them, in your house, for your family. How incredibly generous of you. The sarcasm felt foreign in my mouth, but liberating too. For decades, I'd been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and gave everyone the benefit of the doubt. But sometimes sarcasm is the only appropriate response to breathtaking selfishness. Rachel was openly crying now, her perfect facade crumbling along with her elaborate justifications. Please don't tell the rest of the family. Please. We can work this out between us. I'll give everything back, I promise. The rest of the family. I repeated the words slowly, letting their full meaning sink in. Who else knows about this, Rachel? Who else has been helping themselves to pieces of my life? Her silence was answer enough. My children. My own children knew what she was doing and said nothing. Maybe they were even participants, dividing up their father's belongings while their mother sat alone in her apartment, crying over empty spaces where his memories should have been. The betrayal was complete now, total and devastating. Not just Rachel's greed, but the complicity of everyone I'd loved and trusted. They'd all stood by and watched her steal from me, lie to me, treat me like a doddering old woman who wouldn't notice her life being dismantled piece by piece. I want everything back, I said quietly. Every coin, every tool, every single thing you took from my house. And I want it back today. Helen, please be reasonable. Reasonable? The word exploded from me with surprising force. I've been reasonable for 74 years. I was reasonable when you needed money for your car. I was reasonable when you excluded me from family plans. I was reasonable when you spoke for me and dismissed my feelings and treated me like a burden instead of the family matriarch who'd earned everyone's respect. But stealing from a grieving widow? That's where my reasonableness ends. I turned toward the door, George's watch heavy in my hand. You have until tonight to return everything. If you don't, I'll be calling the police. You wouldn't. But her voice lacked conviction. Maybe she was finally starting to understand that the meek, accommodating Helen was disappearing, replaced by someone who'd had enough. Try me, I said, and walked out of her perfect house into the bright Chicago afternoon. The drive home was surreal. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Rachel following me, trying to manage the crisis she'd created. But the streets of Lincoln Park gave way to my own familiar neighborhood without incident. Just another Wednesday afternoon in a city where millions of people carried their own burdens and betrayals, most of them hidden behind pleasant facades. Back in my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table where George and I had shared thousands of meals, holding his watch and trying to process what had just happened. Everything I'd believed about my family, about my place in their lives, about the love and respect I thought I'd earned, all of it was built on lies. The watch felt different now. Heavier somehow, weighted not just with George's memory, but with the knowledge of how easily our most precious things can be taken from us. I fastened it around my wrist, feeling the familiar leather against my skin. It was too big, of course, made for a man's wrist, not mine, but I didn't care. For the first time since George died, I had a piece of him that no one could steal or dismiss or explain away. That evening, my phone started ringing. First Michael, then Sarah, then David. Rachel had clearly been busy making phone calls, spinning her version of events, trying to get ahead of the story. I let them all go to voicemail, not ready to hear their explanations or excuses or attempts to smooth things over. When I finally listened to the messages, the pattern was depressingly familiar. Concern for my mental state. Suggestions that grief might be affecting my judgment. Gentle implications that I was overreacting to a simple misunderstanding. Not one of them expressed outrage that their stepmother had been systematically stealing from me. Not one seemed to grasp the magnitude of the betrayal. Michael's message was the worst. "Mom, Rachel called and she's really upset. She says you're accusing her of stealing Dad's things, but we all know how confused you've been since he died. Maybe you packed some stuff away and forgot about it? Why don't you come over for dinner tomorrow and we can all talk this through calmly?" Confused. That word again. The label they'd been attaching to me for months. As if grief automatically meant mental incompetence. As if losing my husband somehow invalidated my ability to recognize my own possessions or remember my own experiences. I called Michael back around 9 o'clock, when I was sure the dinner dishes were done and the grandchildren were in bed. His wife Linda answered, her voice carefully neutral. "Hi, Helen. How are you feeling tonight?" Even Linda was treating me like an invalid now. This woman who'd once called me mom, who'd sought my advice on everything from child rearing to career decisions, was speaking to me like I might shatter at any moment. "I'm feeling angry," I said simply, "and betrayed. And like I no longer recognize the family I spent 60 years building." There was a pause before Michael came on the line. "Mom, let's not get dramatic about this. Rachel says it was all a misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding." My voice was steady, but firm. "She stole your father's watch. She stole his coin collection, his tools, his books, and who knows what else. She lied to my face about it for 18 months while I grieved and searched and blamed myself for losing track of his things. That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft." Another pause. I could picture them in their comfortable suburban kitchen, exchanging meaningful looks, trying to decide how to handle their unreasonable mother. "Okay," Michael said finally. "Even if she did take some things, maybe she was trying to preserve them. You know how scattered you've been since Dad died. Maybe she was worried you'd lose them, or maybe," I interrupted, "she's a thief who took advantage of a grieving widow and convinced her son that his mother was too incompetent to notice her life being stolen piece by piece." The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. My own son believed Rachel's version of events more readily than mine. The mother who'd raised him, sacrificed for him, loved him unconditionally for 43 years, was less credible than a woman who'd married into the family 15 years ago. "I want you to think about something," I said quietly. "I want you to imagine that Linda died tomorrow, and while you were planning her funeral and trying to figure out how to live without her, suppose I came into your house and started taking her jewelry, her books, her photographs. Suppose I told you I was preserving them, protecting them from your grief-induced confusion. How would that feel?" "Mom, that's not the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing." I was crying now, but my voice remained steady. "Your father's possessions were all I had left of him. They were my connection to 47 years of marriage, to a love story that shaped both of your lives. And Rachel stole them while I was vulnerable and alone. I'll talk to her tomorrow," he said finally. "I'll make sure she returns whatever she took. It's too late for that." The words came out harder than I'd intended, but they felt right. The damage is done. She chose to steal from me, and you chose to believe her excuses rather than trust your own mother. Those are choices, Michael, and choices have consequences. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and grief. The apartment felt different now, like a stage set for a play I no longer wanted to perform in. The familiar furniture, the photographs on the walls, even the lingering scent of George's cologne. Everything seemed tainted by the knowledge of what my family really thought of me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the rooms George and I had shared, seeing them with new eyes. The empty spaces where his belongings should have been weren't just casualties of death anymore. They were evidence of betrayal, proof that my own family had been quietly erasing him from my life, While I struggled to hold on to his memory, I found myself in his workshop, a tiny converted closet where he'd spent hours tinkering with broken appliances and building small projects for the grandchildren. The pegboard on the wall was half empty, tool outlines marking spaces where hammers and screwdrivers should have been hanging. I'd attributed the gaps to my own failing memory, assuming I'd misplaced things or forgotten where he'd stored them. But now I knew better. Rachel and James had systematically removed pieces of George from this room, this apartment, this life we'd built together. They'd stolen not just objects, but the comfort those objects provided, the tangible proof that he'd existed, that our love had been real, that I wasn't just a lonely old woman clinging to fading memories. Standing in that empty workshop at 2 a.m, wearing George's watch on my too small wrist, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be reasonable anymore. I wasn't going to make excuses for people who saw my grief as an opportunity. I wasn't going to let them convince me that I was confused or dramatic or overreacting. I was going to fight back. The next morning, I called the Chicago Police Department non-emergency line and explained the situation to a patient officer who took down all the details. He was kind, but matter-of-fact, explaining that theft within families was unfortunately common and often difficult to prosecute. He suggested I try to resolve things privately first, but confirmed that I had legal options if necessary. Then I called Sarah's office. "Mom?" She sounded surprised to hear from me during working hours. "Is everything okay?" "I need to know something," I said without preamble. "Did you know that Rachel has been stealing your father's belongings?" A long pause. "Mom, I really can't talk about family drama right now. I'm in the middle of a presentation prep. This isn't drama, this is theft. Did you know?" Another pause. Longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, measured. I knew she was helping to organize Dad's things. "We all thought it would be easier for you if someone else handled the difficult stuff. Organizing." I repeated the word slowly. "Is that what you call it when someone takes valuable items from a dead man's house and lies to his widow about it?" "Mom, please. You're making this sound much worse than it is." Rachel was trying to help. "By stealing his watch and wearing it to family dinners? By giving his coin collection to her husband? By taking his tools and books and lying to my face about it for 18 months? Silence on the other end of the line. I could picture Sarah at her modern downtown office, probably worried that her coworkers might overhear this conversation about her dramatic mother. "I'll call you back tonight," she said finally, "when I can talk properly." But she didn't call back that night, or the next. None of them did. The family communication network that had buzzed with activity during George's illness and funeral went completely silent when confronted with uncomfortable truths about their own behavior. By Friday, I still hadn't heard from Rachel about returning the stolen items. No apologetic phone calls, no boxes delivered to my door, no acknowledgement that she'd done anything wrong. Instead, I heard through my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, that Rachel had been telling people I was having some mental health issues and making wild accusations about missing items that were probably just misplaced. That afternoon, I called the police officer back and filed an official report. He arrived at my apartment an hour later with a younger partner, both of them professional and respectful, as I showed them the empty spaces where George's belongings should have been and provided documentation of his possessions. The senior officer, Detective Rodriguez, had intelligent brown eyes and the patient manner of someone who'd dealt with family conflicts before. He listened carefully as I explained the situation, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that showed he was taking me seriously. "Mrs. Thompson," he said when I'd finished, "I want you to understand that prosecuting family members is always complicated. Are you certain you want to pursue this legally?" "I'm certain," I said. "These people have spent 18 months convincing me that I was confused, that I was imagining things, that my grief was making me unreliable. They stole from me, and then tried to make me believe it was my own fault for losing track of my husband's possessions. If I don't stand up to this, they'll keep treating me like I'm incompetent for the rest of my life." He nodded, understanding more than I'd expected. "We'll start by contacting Mrs. Rachel Thompson and requesting the return of the items. If she cooperates, we can handle this without formal charges. If not," he shrugged, "well, theft is theft, regardless of family relationships. That evening, Rachel called me for the first time since our confrontation. Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "I cannot believe you called the police on me, Helen. On your own family member. George would be ashamed of you." The mention of George's name in that context hit me like a physical blow. How dare she invoke his memory to guilt me into accepting her theft? How dare she pretend to know what my husband would have wanted when she'd spent months systematically erasing him from my life? "George would be ashamed of someone who stole from his widow," I said quietly. "He would be furious that his sister-in-law took advantage of my grief to help herself to his most treasured possessions. I wasn't stealing. I was preserving things, protecting them from being lost or thrown away. You were in no condition to make decisions about his belongings. So you decided to make those decisions for me? Without asking? Without even telling me?" The anger was building again, hot and righteous. "You sat in my kitchen and helped me search for his watch, knowing it was in your car the whole time. You let me blame myself for losing his coin collection when you'd already given it to James. That's not preservation, Rachel. That's cruelty." A long silence then. "The whole family thinks you're overreacting. Michael says you've been unstable since George died, and now this proves it. Normal people don't call the police on their own relatives over a few trinkets." Trinkets. She called George's most precious possessions trinkets, as if 47 years of marriage could be reduced to a handful of insignificant objects. The word hit me like a slap, crystallizing everything I'd been feeling into sudden, perfect clarity. "You're right," I said calmly. "Normal people don't call the police on their relatives. Normal people also don't steal from grieving widows. Normal people don't lie to their family members for 18 months. Normal people don't try to convince someone they're losing their mind, rather than admit they've done something wrong. So I guess neither of us is normal, are we? Helen, please. Think about what you're doing to this family. Think about the grandchildren. What this will do to them if it goes public. Do you really want to be known as the crazy grandmother who sent their aunt to jail over a few old things?" The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Now she was concerned about the grandchildren? Now she cared about the family reputation? Where had that concern been when she was taking my husband's belongings piece by piece? "I'll tell you what," I said. "You have until tomorrow night to return every single thing you took from my house. Every coin, every tool, every book, everything. If you do that, and if you write me a letter explaining exactly what you took and when, I'll consider dropping the charges. And if I don't? Then you'll find out what happens when someone finally holds you accountable for your actions." I hung up and turned off my phone, not interested in whatever response she might have. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the grief-stricken widow everyone expected me to be. Not the confused old woman who needed to be managed and protected. Just Helen, a woman who'd had enough of being lied to and stolen from by people who claimed to love her. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and George's watch on my wrist, planning what came next. Because regardless of whether Rachel returned his belongings, something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of my family and my place in it. The relationships I'd spent decades nurturing and protecting had revealed themselves to be built on a foundation of disrespect and exploitation. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Do you know what it feels like to realize that your whole life has been built on other people's willingness to take advantage of your generosity? Have you ever had to choose between family peace and your own dignity? Saturday came and went with no word from Rachel. No boxes delivered, no phone calls, no acknowledgement of my ultimatum. I spent the weekend in a strange state of calm anticipation, like the eye of a hurricane where everything is still and quiet before the real storm hits. Sunday afternoon, Detective Rodriguez called to check in. Rachel had contacted the police department, he said, claiming I was harassing her and making false accusations against an innocent family member who'd been trying to help me through my grief. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her that theft is a matter of evidence, not family opinion," he said dryly, "and that we'd like to examine the items you've identified as stolen property." She didn't seem enthusiastic about the idea. "So what happens now?" "Now we move forward formally. I'll need you to come in and make a detailed statement about everything that's missing. We'll also need documentation of ownership where possible, photographs, receipts, anything that proves these items belong to your husband." The next morning, I gathered every photo I could find of George wearing his watch, working with his tools, or showing off additions to his coin collection. 47 years of marriage had produced a lot of documentation, more than I'd realized. Birthday pictures where he proudly displayed a new coin, workshop photos where his favorite hammer was visible on the pegboard, Christmas morning shots where his watch caught the flash as he opened presents with the grandchildren. Looking through those photos was like watching our life together in reverse, year by year back to when we were young and everything seemed possible. In every single picture, George looked happy, not just content, but genuinely joyful to be surrounded by the family we'd built together. The man who'd worked double shifts to pay for his children's education, who'd sacrificed vacations to help with down payments and emergencies, who'd loved us all with the kind of steady devotion that quietly shapes everything around it. He would have been heartbroken to see what had happened to that family after his death, but I think he would have been proud of me for finally standing up for myself, for refusing to be diminished or dismissed or stolen from anymore. At the police station, Detective Rodriguez introduced me to a victim's advocate named Maria, who'd worked with elderly victims of financial exploitation before. She was probably my daughter's age, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that put me immediately at ease. "This is more common than you might think," she told me as I signed the formal complaint. "Family members often justify taking from elderly relatives by claiming they're protecting assets or preventing loss. But regardless of the excuse, taking someone's possessions without permission is theft. My son thinks I'm overreacting," I admitted. "They all think grief is making me unstable." Maria nodded knowingly. "That's part of the pattern, too. When elderly people report theft or abuse by family members, they're often dismissed as confused or vindictive. It's a way of avoiding accountability while making the victim doubt their own perceptions." Hearing someone else articulate what I'd been feeling was incredibly validating. For months, I'd been questioning my own memory, my own judgment, my own worthiness of respect and honesty. But sitting in that small interview room with people who believed me and took my concerns seriously, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost 2 years: the simple dignity of being heard. The next few days were a blur of legal paperwork and family drama. Word spread quickly through our extended family network that I'd filed charges against Rachel. The reactions were predictably polarized. Some relatives expressed quiet support, while others were horrified that I'd aired our dirty laundry publicly. My phone rang constantly with calls from cousins, neighbors, and family friends who'd heard various versions of the story. Some were supportive, sharing their own experiences with financial exploitation or offering to testify about George's possessions if needed. Others were clearly calling to gather gossip or try to talk me out of pursuing legal action. The most painful call came from my youngest grandchild, Emma, who was 16 and had always been especially close to me. She called crying, begging me to drop the charges against Aunt Rachel because it was tearing the family apart. "Grandma, please," she sobbed. "Everyone's fighting and taking sides, and Mom says we might not have Christmas together this year because of all this drama. Can't you just forgive her and move on?" It broke my heart to hear her pain, to know that my decision to stand up for myself was causing stress for someone I loved so much. But it also crystallized something important for me. "Emma," I said gently, "what would you do if someone stole your most precious possessions and then lied to you about it for 2 years?" I don't know, but she's family. Being family doesn't give someone the right to steal from you, sweetheart. Being family doesn't mean you have to accept being lied to or treated badly. If anything, family members should treat each other better than strangers, not worse." She was quiet for a long moment. "But what if everyone gets mad at you? What if they stop talking to you? Then I'll know where I really stood with them all along," I said. "And maybe that's something I need to know." After I hung up, I sat in George's chair by the window and thought about family loyalty and what it really means. For my entire adult life, I'd believed that keeping the peace was the highest good, that maintaining family unity was worth almost any personal sacrifice. But sitting there with his watch on my wrist, surrounded by the empty spaces where his belongings should have been, I realized that peace bought with dignity isn't really peace at all. It's just surrender. The following Tuesday, Detective Rodriguez called with an update. Rachel's attorney had contacted the prosecutor's office, requesting a meeting to discuss resolving this matter quietly. Translation: they wanted to make a deal that would avoid the embarrassment of a public trial. What kind of deal? I asked. Full restitution of all stolen items, a written apology, and possibly community service. No jail time, but a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a legal agreement not to harass you further. It wasn't everything I'd wanted. Some vindictive part of me had fantasized about Rachel in handcuffs, learning what it felt like to be powerless and afraid, but it was more than I'd dared hope for when this started. Official acknowledgement that I'd been wronged, legal protection against future retaliation, and most importantly, the return of George's possessions. I'll consider it, I told him, but I want to see everything returned first. I want to hold his watch and his coins and his tools in my hands before I agree to anything. Fair enough? I'll let them know. That evening, as if she'd been waiting for news of the plea negotiation, Sarah finally called me back. Mom, I think we need to talk. Her voice was different, less dismissive, more careful. Maybe the reality of legal proceedings had finally made it clear that this wasn't just about my emotional state or grief-induced confusion. I'm listening, I said. I heard about the plea deal, about Rachel agreeing to return Dad's things. And? A long pause. And I owe you an apology. I should have listened to you from the beginning. I should have taken your concerns seriously instead of assuming you were just struggling. It was a start, but not nearly enough. Did you know Sarah? Did you know what she was doing? Another pause, longer this time. I knew she was organizing some of Dad's belongings. She said you'd asked her to help, that it was too painful for you to deal with directly. But you never checked with me. In 18 months, you never once asked me directly what I wanted done with his things. No, she admitted quietly. I didn't. I trusted her version because it seemed reasonable, because I wanted to believe that someone was taking care of the difficult stuff so you wouldn't have to. And when I started asking about missing items, when I told you I couldn't find his watch or his coin collection, I thought... She trailed off, then started again. I thought grief was making you forget where you'd put things. I thought maybe you'd donated them or stored them somewhere and couldn't remember. It seemed kinder to let you think they were just misplaced than to worry you about it. Kinder. That word hung between us like a bridge made of lies. How many cruel things had been done to me in the name of kindness? How many decisions had been made about my life by people who thought they knew what was best for me? Sarah, I said carefully, I want you to really think about this. For 47 years, I managed a household, raised 3 children, helped run your father's business bookkeeping, and kept track of thousands of details about our life together. What made you think that George's death would suddenly make me incapable of remembering my own belongings? Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence while my successful, intelligent daughter grappled with the implications of her own assumptions about my competence. I don't know, she whispered finally. I guess I wanted to believe that someone else was handling the hard stuff because I didn't want to deal with it myself. It was easier to let Rachel manage you than to figure out how to help you grieve. There it was. The uncomfortable truth underneath all the manipulation and assumptions. It wasn't just about Rachel's greed or my children's dismissive attitudes. It was about how uncomfortable death makes everyone. How much easier it is to let someone else deal with the messy emotional work of supporting a grieving person. I needed you, I said simply. I needed my children to help me figure out how to live without your father. Instead, I got managed by someone who saw my vulnerability as an opportunity to steal from me. I know, she said, crying now. I know, and I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this. You start by believing me when I tell you things. You start by treating me like an adult who's capable of making decisions about her own life. And you start by acknowledging that your father's death didn't make me incompetent. It just made me sad. We talked for another hour, the longest real conversation we'd had since George died. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. There was too much hurt and too many betrayals to work through, but it was a beginning. For the first time in months, I felt like Sarah was talking to her mother instead of managing an elderly relative. The next day, a moving truck pulled up in front of my building. 2 men carried box after box up to my apartment, each one labeled in Rachel's precise handwriting. Coins, tools, workshop books, personal items. There were more boxes than I'd expected, evidence of thefts I hadn't even discovered yet. Detective Rodriguez supervised the return, checking items against the list I'd provided and documenting everything for the court records. Rachel wasn't there. Her attorney had apparently advised against any direct contact, but James came to oversee the process. He couldn't meet my eyes, just stood in my living room looking uncomfortable, while strangers returned my husband's belongings to their rightful place. "Helen," he said quietly when the movers were almost finished, "I want you to know that I never wanted it to go this far. I told Rachel we should have asked you about the items from the beginning." "Then why didn't you speak up when she lied to my face about them?" I asked. He shifted uncomfortably, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I don't know. Marriage is complicated. Sometimes you go along with things you shouldn't." It wasn't much of an explanation, but it was more honesty than I'd gotten from anyone else in the family. At least he looked ashamed of what they'd done, unlike Rachel, who seemed to view herself as the victim of my unreasonable behavior. After everyone left, I stood alone in my apartment surrounded by boxes of George's belongings. It should have been a moment of pure triumph. I'd stood up to the people who'd stolen from me and won. But mostly, I felt exhausted and sad, like I'd won a battle that never should have been necessary. Opening the boxes was like excavating our life together. His coin collection, carefully preserved in plastic holders with handwritten labels showing dates and locations where each piece had been acquired. His tools, some of them older than our marriage, worn smooth by decades of use. Books about woodworking and electronics and Chicago history, margins filled with his careful notes. And in the last box, wrapped in tissue paper like something precious, was the workshop clock that had timed so many of his projects. It was a simple electric clock with a white face and black hands, the kind you might find in any garage or basement. But seeing it again made me cry harder than I had since the day he died, because it represented something I'd thought was lost forever. Proof that our ordinary daily life together had been real and important and worthy of preservation. I spent the rest of that day putting George's belongings back where they belonged. Coins in the desk drawer where he'd always kept them, tools on the pegboard in his workshop, books on the shelf beside his reading chair, the clock back on the workshop wall, ticking steadily like a heartbeat. My apartment felt whole again, full of his presence in a way it hadn't been since the day he died. But something had changed in me during those months of emptiness. I was no longer the woman who'd depended on his possessions to feel connected to his memory. I'd learned to carry him with me in ways that couldn't be stolen or lost or given away. A week later, I received a formal letter of apology from Rachel's attorney, acknowledging that she had improperly removed items from my home and expressing regret for the misunderstanding that had resulted. It was a carefully worded non-apology that took responsibility for nothing, while appearing to express remorse. But it was legally binding, and it would prevent her from claiming in the future that I'd imagined the whole thing. The criminal charges were dropped in exchange for her completion of 40 hours of community service with an organization that helped elderly victims of financial exploitation. There was poetry in that, I thought, making her spend time with other people she'd taken advantage of, even if she was too self-absorbed to recognize the irony. But the real victory wasn't legal. It was personal. It was the knowledge that I'd found my voice again, that I'd refused to accept being diminished or dismissed or stolen from anymore. The frightened, confused widow who'd blamed herself for missing belongings was gone, replaced by someone stronger and clearer about her own worth. The family dynamics shifted after that, slowly, and not always smoothly. Some relationships were damaged beyond repair. I doubt I'll ever trust Rachel again, and I suspect she'll never forgive me for refusing to be victimized quietly. But other relationships deepened, strengthened by the honesty that conflict had forced into the open. Michael and I began having real conversations about how to support each other without falling into the old patterns of him managing my life. David started calling more often, asking about my days and my feelings instead of just checking boxes on his filial duty list. Sarah and I began rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than protective condescension. Not all of my children's spouses were happy with the changes. Linda had clearly preferred the version of me that deferred to everyone else's judgment and never caused uncomfortable scenes at family gatherings. But I was no longer interested in making everyone else comfortable at the expense of my own dignity. The grandchildren adjusted better than the adults, with the resilience that children often show when the grown-ups stop pretending everything is fine. Emma apologized for pressuring me to drop the charges, saying she'd learned something important about standing up for yourself even when it's difficult. My teenage grandson Marcus asked to hear the whole story, then told me he was proud of me for not letting them get away with it. But the most unexpected change was in myself. Somewhere in the process of fighting for George's belongings, I'd rediscovered my own strength and independence. The woman who'd defined herself primarily as wife, mother, and grandmother for 7 decades was learning to be just Helen, a person worthy of respect and honesty in her own right. I started taking art classes at the community center, something I'd always wanted to do but never found time for during the busy years of child rearing and caregiving. I joined a book club at the local library, discussing novels with other women who'd also rediscovered their love of reading in their later years. I even began volunteering at the same organization where Rachel was completing her court-ordered service, helping other elderly people navigate financial exploitation and family betrayal. Working with other victims taught me how common my experience really was. Story after story of adult children who saw their parents' assets as their inheritance to manage, family members who justified theft as protection, relatives who dismissed legitimate concerns as signs of declining mental capacity. The patterns were depressingly familiar, but so was the strength people found when they finally decided to fight back. One evening, about 6 months after the legal proceedings ended, I was sitting in George's chair with his watch on my wrist, reading a mystery novel from my book club, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. "Mrs. Thompson? This is Detective Martinez with the Chicago Police. I got your number from Detective Rodriguez. I'm working on a case that's very similar to yours, and I wondered if you might be willing to speak with another elderly woman who's dealing with family financial exploitation." I agreed immediately, remembering how alone and crazy I'd felt before Maria and Detective Rodriguez had validated my experience. If I could help another person avoid that isolation, it would give meaning to everything I'd gone through. The woman's name was Betty, and she was 78 years old. Her nephew had been systematically draining her savings account for 2 years, telling her he was investing her money in high-yield opportunities that never seemed to generate returns. Like me, she'd been made to feel confused and paranoid when she asked questions. Like me, she'd been told that family members were just looking out for her best interests. "I keep thinking maybe I am losing my mind," she told me over coffee at a downtown diner. "Maybe I really did agree to let him manage my money and I just don't remember." "You're not losing your mind," I said firmly. "You're being manipulated by someone who's counting on your self-doubt to keep you from protecting yourself." We talked for 2 hours, sharing stories and strategies, and the strange comfort that comes from knowing you're not alone in your experience. By the end of our conversation, Betty had decided to file a police report and consult with an elder law attorney about recovering her stolen savings. "Thank you," she said as we parted ways. I was ready to give up, to just accept that this was what family looked like now, but talking to someone who's been through it and come out the other side, it helps. Driving home that afternoon, I realized something that might have surprised the grieving women I'd been a year earlier. I was happy. Not just content or at peace, but genuinely happy in a way I hadn't been since before George's illness began. The life I was building without him was smaller than what we'd had together, but it was authentically mine in ways our married life never could have been. That evening, I called Sarah to tell her about my conversation with Betty. We'd been talking regularly since our reconciliation, slowly rebuilding trust and understanding. She'd even started asking for my advice about work situations and parenting challenges, treating me like the competent adult I'd always been instead of the confused, elderly relative she'd convinced herself I'd become. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said when I finished telling her about Betty's situation. "I'm proud that you turned something awful into a way to help other people." "I learned something from George's death that I didn't expect," I told her. "I learned that losing someone you love either makes you smaller or it makes you bigger. For a while, I was getting smaller, letting other people define my worth, accepting their version of who I was supposed to be. But fighting for his belongings taught me that I could choose to get bigger instead." "What do you mean by bigger?" More myself. More willing to speak up for what I believe. More confident in my own perceptions and decisions. Less worried about making other people comfortable if it means making myself smaller. We talked until late that night. One of those rambling conversations that covers everything and nothing. The kind George and I used to have during his final months when time felt precious. And we wanted to say everything important before it was too late. But this conversation was about moving forward instead of looking backward. About building something new instead of mourning something lost. A few weeks later, I got unexpected news. The community center where I'd been taking art classes was organizing a show featuring work by senior artists. My instructor, a patient woman named Claire, who'd encouraged my tentative experiments with watercolors, suggested I submit some paintings. I don't know, I said doubtfully. I've only been painting for a few months. I'm not really an artist. You're someone who creates art, she replied simply. That makes you an artist. Besides, this isn't about professional quality. It's about showing that creativity doesn't end at 60 or 70 or 80. I selected 3 small paintings to submit: a view of Lake Michigan from my apartment window, a still life of George's tools arranged on his workbench, and an abstract piece I'd painted during a particularly difficult day. All angry reds and deep blues swirling together like emotions I couldn't put into words. The opening reception was on a Thursday evening in early spring. I almost didn't go, suddenly seized with nervousness about displaying my amateur work in public. But as I stood in front of my closet debating what to wear, my eyes fell on George's watch sitting on the dresser where I kept it at night. He would have wanted me to go. He would have been proud that I was trying something new, sharing something personal, refusing to hide in the apartment where we'd been happy together. So I put on my best dress and his watch and went to celebrate my small step into the larger world. The community center was crowded with families and friends, people laughing and talking and moving from piece to piece with wine glasses in their hands. I found my 3 paintings hung together on a wall near the windows, with a small placard that read, Helen Thompson, Beginner's Heart, Experienced Eyes. Mom! Sarah's voice behind me made me turn in surprise. She was there with her teenage daughter, both of them dressed up for the occasion. What are you doing here? I asked, touched and flustered. Claire called me, Sarah said, smiling. She thought you might like some family support for your artistic debut. I hope that's okay. It was more than okay. It was wonderful to have them there. To see my granddaughter studying my paintings with genuine interest. To feel supported in this new adventure instead of managed or dismissed. I like the one with Grandpa's tools, Emma said thoughtfully. It looks sad but also hopeful, like something ending but also something beginning. She was right, I realized. That's exactly what the painting was about. Endings and beginnings, loss and discovery. The way life keeps offering new chances even when you think you're too old or too tired or too broken to take them. Other people stopped to look at my work throughout the evening. An elderly man who'd lost his wife 2 years earlier stood for a long time in front of the Lake Michigan painting, then told me quietly that it captured something he'd been feeling but couldn't express. A middle-aged woman asked about my technique for the abstract piece, saying she was inspired to try painting as therapy for her own difficult emotions. By the end of the evening, I'd sold 2 of the 3 paintings to people who connected with them personally. The money wasn't important, barely enough to cover the cost of supplies, but the connection was everything. My small attempts to make sense of loss and renewal had spoken to other people dealing with their own transitions and challenges. Driving home that night with Sarah and Emma, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride in my own accomplishments rather than just pride in my family's achievements. For decades, I'd defined success as how well my children were doing, how stable my marriage was, how smoothly I could manage everyone else's needs. But sitting in that community center with strangers admiring my amateur paintings, I'd felt successful as myself, as Helen the artist, not just Helen the wife and mother. You know what I realized tonight? I told Sarah as she walked me to my apartment door. What's that? George's death wasn't just an ending. It was also a beginning. I spent so many months focusing on what I'd lost that I didn't notice what I was gaining. What are you gaining? I thought about it for a moment, watching Emma examine the coins in George's collection with the same careful attention she'd given my paintings. Freedom, I suppose. The freedom to discover who I am when I'm not taking care of everyone else. The freedom to say no when people take advantage of me. The freedom to create something new instead of just maintaining something old. Sarah hugged me goodnight, holding on a little longer than usual. "I'm still sorry," she said quietly, "for not seeing who you were becoming, for treating you like you were diminishing when you were actually growing." "We all made mistakes," I replied. "The important thing is that we're learning from them." After they left, I sat in George's chair with a cup of tea, surrounded by his restored belongings, but no longer dependent on them for my sense of connection to him. The watch was on my wrist where it belonged, but I'd learned that his love lived in my choices and actions, not in objects that could be stolen or lost. I thought about calling Betty to tell her about the art show, to share this small victory with someone who understood the journey from victim to survivor. But it was late, and the story could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was for sitting quietly with my own sense of accomplishment, for recognizing how far I'd traveled from the frightened, confused woman who'd found her husband's watch in a sister-in-law's glove compartment. The city sparkled outside my window, millions of lights marking millions of lives, each one carrying its own stories of loss and discovery, betrayal and renewal. Somewhere out there, another elderly person was probably discovering that their family saw them as a resource to exploit rather than a person to respect. Somewhere else, someone was finding the courage to fight back against manipulation and theft. And in quiet apartments and assisted living facilities across Chicago, people my age were figuring out who they wanted to be in the years they had left. I was one of them now, not just surviving my husband's death, but building something meaningful from the ruins of old assumptions about family, aging, and self-worth. It had taken theft and betrayal and legal proceedings to wake me up, but sometimes the most painful experiences lead to the most important discoveries. George's watch ticked steadily on my wrist as I finished my tea and prepared for bed. Tomorrow I would call Betty and share the news about the art show. Tomorrow I would work on a new painting, something bright and forward-looking to balance the sadness of my earlier work. Tomorrow I would continue building this new life, one small choice at a time. But tonight was for recognizing how much I'd changed, how much I'd grown, how much strength I'd discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. Tonight was for being proud of the woman I'd become, someone who'd refused to be diminished, someone who'd found her voice again, someone who'd learned that it's never too late to stand up for yourself and demand the respect you deserve. The last thing I did before turning off the lights was to look at George's photograph on the nightstand, the same picture that had comforted me through 18 months of grief and confusion. "I did it," I whispered to his familiar smile. "I got your things back. I got myself back. I think you'd be proud." In the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by his restored belongings and my own new creations, I felt his presence not as a haunting reminder of loss, but as a blessing on the life I was still learning to live. The worst thing that could happen to our marriage, his death, had led to the best thing that could happen to me, the discovery of my own resilience and worth. It had taken 74 years and a stolen watch to teach me that lesson, but some wisdom is worth waiting for. Some strength only comes through testing. Some freedom can only be earned by refusing to accept anything less than the dignity and respect that every person deserves, regardless of age or circumstances or family dynamics. As I drifted off to sleep with George's watch still on my wrist, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this place of hard-won peace. The road had been difficult, marked by betrayal and legal battles and painful conversations with children who'd stopped seeing me as a person in my own right. But it had led me home to myself, which was perhaps the most valuable destination of all. 6 months later, I received a phone call that would test everything I'd learned about standing up for myself. It was from a social worker at Chicago General Hospital. "Mrs. Thompson, this is calling about your sister-in-law, Rachel Thompson. She's been admitted with a serious heart condition, and she's listed you as her emergency contact." My first thought was that there must be some mistake. After everything that had happened between us, why would Rachel list me as her emergency contact? We hadn't spoken since the police investigation ended, moving in completely separate family circles to avoid uncomfortable encounters. "Are you sure?" I asked. We don't have a close relationship. I'm looking at her admission paperwork right now, the social worker replied. You're listed as the primary contact, along with your phone number. She's asking to see you. I sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes after hanging up, staring at George's watch and trying to process this unexpected development. Part of me wanted to ignore the call, to let Rachel face her medical crisis without my involvement after everything she'd put me through. But another part of me, the part that George would have recognized, couldn't quite abandon someone who was scared and alone in a hospital bed, no matter what they'd done to me. I called Sarah to talk through the situation, needing someone else's perspective on whether I was being foolish or compassionate. You don't owe her anything, Mom, Sarah said firmly. Not after what she did to you. If she wanted family support during medical emergencies, she shouldn't have stolen from family members. I know that, I replied. But I also know what it feels like to be alone and frightened. I know what it's like when the people you're counting on turn their backs on you. This is different. You were the innocent victim. She was the one who chose to behave badly. Sarah was right, of course. Rachel had made her choices, and those choices had consequences. But as I sat there debating what to do, I realized that my decision wasn't really about Rachel at all. It was about who I wanted to be. What kind of person I'd become through all of this growth and change. I drove to the hospital that evening, telling myself I was just going to see what she wanted and then leave. Nothing more than basic human decency required, with clear boundaries about what I was and wasn't willing to provide. Rachel looked older and frailer than I'd expected, hooked up to monitors and IV lines in the cardiac care unit. Her perfectly styled hair was limp against the hospital pillow, and her designer clothes had been replaced by a standard hospital gown that made her seem smaller and more vulnerable. "Helen," she said when she saw me, tears starting immediately. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I said honestly, pulling a chair beside her bed. "What's going on with your heart?" "Irregular rhythm. They're saying I need surgery, maybe a pacemaker." Her voice was shaky, scared in a way I'd never heard before. James is out of town on business and the kids are both in college. I didn't know who else to call. It was such a small admission, but it revealed everything about how isolated Rachel had become. Despite her social connections and perfect house and apparent success, she'd reached a medical crisis with no one close enough to call for help except the woman she'd stolen from and betrayed. "Where are Michael and David?" I asked. "Where are your other family members?" She looked away, embarrassed. "Things have been complicated since all that legal stuff. People are uncomfortable around me now. They don't know what to believe about what happened. So the consequences of her actions were finally catching up with her. Not just with me, but with the entire extended family. People were questioning her character, her honesty, her version of events. She was experiencing the same kind of isolation and dismissal that I'd endured for months, except that hers was earned while mine had been imposed. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sound coming from her heart monitor and the general bustle of the hospital around us. I found myself studying her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse or just self-pity at being caught and punished for her behavior. "I'm sorry," she said finally, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "I'm sorry for what I did, for how I treated you. I'm sorry for taking George's things and lying about them. I'm sorry for making you feel like you were losing your mind when you were just trying to grieve your husband." It was the first real apology I'd received from her, without qualifications or justifications or attempts to minimize what she'd done. Just simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing and its impact on me. "Why did you do it?" I asked. "Why did you take his belongings and lie to me for so long?" She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I could. Because you were vulnerable and trusting. And I thought you'd never notice or never have the strength to fight back if you did notice." She looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in years. "I didn't see you as a person with rights and feelings. I saw you as an obstacle to managing George's estate efficiently." The honesty was brutal, but also liberating. Finally, someone was acknowledging what I'd known but been made to doubt, that I'd been systematically devalued and exploited by people who were supposed to care about me. "The watch," I said. "Why the watch in particular?" Because James had always admired it. Because it seemed like something George would want to stay in the family. And you don't really wear men's watches anyway. She paused, then added, because I thought it would be easy to convince you that you'd misplaced it or donated it accidentally. So even that small, precious connection to my husband had been calculated as expendable, something I could be manipulated into forgetting or doubting. The casual cruelty of it still took my breath away. Do you understand what you took from me? I asked. It wasn't just objects. You took my confidence in my own memory, my trust in my family, my sense of being valued and respected. You made me feel like I was losing my mind during the most difficult period of my life. I know, she whispered, tears flowing freely now. I know, and I hate myself for it. I hate that I became the kind of person who would hurt someone when they're already suffering. We talked for another hour, a conversation unlike any we'd ever had. For the first time, Rachel spoke to me like an equal instead of managing me like a problem to be solved. She told me about her own fears of aging, of becoming dependent, of being seen as useless by people who'd once valued her for her competence and control. I think I saw you as what I might become, she admitted, lonely and vulnerable and dependent on other people's kindness. It terrified me, so I tried to maintain control by controlling you. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it helped me understand the psychology behind it. Rachel's theft wasn't just about greed. It was about her own terror of powerlessness, her desperate attempt to stay in control of something when her brother-in-law's death had reminded her of life's fundamental uncertainty. I need you to know something, I told her as visiting hours were ending. What you did nearly broke me. For months, I thought I was going crazy. I blamed myself for losing track of George's belongings. I let your version of events make me doubt my own perceptions and memories. I'm sorry, she said again. But it also made me stronger. Fighting back, refusing to accept your lies, demanding respect from my own children. All of that taught me things about myself that I might never have learned otherwise. She looked at me with something like wonder. You're different now. Stronger. More present. I had to become different to survive what you put me through. I had to find my voice again, stand up for myself in ways I'd never had to do before. I stood to leave, then turned back. I'm not ready to forgive you, Rachel. Maybe someday, but not yet. But I'm also not going to abandon you when you're scared and alone, because that's not who I want to be. Over the next week, I visited Rachel twice more during her hospital stay. Not as her victim or her family manager, but as someone willing to sit with another human being during a frightening time. We didn't talk much about the past. That wound was too fresh for extended examination, but we had careful conversations about her medical situation and her fears about the future. She had the pacemaker surgery without complications, and her heart rhythm stabilized quickly. But the experience had clearly shaken her in ways that went beyond the medical crisis. She seemed smaller somehow, less certain about her place in the world and her relationships with the people around her. I don't know how to fix what I broke, she told me the day before her discharge. I don't know how to have a relationship with you or the rest of the family after everything that's happened. Maybe you start by being honest about what you did and why, I suggested. Maybe you stop trying to manage other people's reactions and just focus on being accountable for your own actions. And if people can't forgive me, then you learn to live with the consequences of your choices. That's what being an adult means, accepting responsibility for how your actions affect other people, even when the consequences are painful. It was a hard lesson, but one she needed to learn if she was going to have any chance of rebuilding relationships with the family members she'd alienated through her behavior. A month after Rachel's discharge from the hospital, I received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter in a small wrapped box. The letter was from Rachel, and it was unlike anything she'd ever written to me before. Helen, I know that apologies can't undo the harm I caused, but I want you to have something that might help explain why your forgiveness, when and if it comes, would mean so much to me. This was my mother's engagement ring, the only valuable thing she left me when she died. I'm not asking you to keep it, just to know that I understand now what it feels like to have precious memories attached to objects. I understand what I stole from you when I took George's watch and his other belongings. If you want to return this ring, I'll understand. But I wanted you to see that I do have things that matter to me, things that connect me to people I've loved. I should have understood that you felt the same way about George's possessions. I'm working with a therapist now to figure out what made me behave so cruelly to someone who only ever showed me kindness. I don't expect you to wait for me to become a better person, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying. Thank you for sitting with me in the hospital when you had every right to leave me alone with my fear. It showed me a kind of grace I'm not sure I would have been capable of in your position. Rachel. Inside the small box was indeed a beautiful vintage engagement ring, a modest but elegant solitaire that looked like it had been cherished and well cared for over many decades. Holding it, I understood exactly what Rachel was trying to tell me, that she finally grasped what she'd taken from me, not just in terms of monetary value, but in emotional significance. I kept the ring for a week, thinking about what to do with it. It was probably worth several $100s, but its real value was in what it represented. Rachel's first genuine acknowledgement of the damage she'd caused, and her willingness to make herself vulnerable in return. Finally, I wrapped it carefully and mailed it back to her with a short note. This belongs to you and your family history, just as George's belongings belong to me and mine. But thank you for helping me understand that you're beginning to see me as a person whose feelings matter. That recognition is worth more to me than any object could be. The ring came back 3 days later with another note. You're right that it belongs with my family, but I want it to go to someone who understands the difference between preserving memories and stealing them. Would you consider giving this to Emma when she gets engaged someday? I think George would have liked the idea of our families being connected by something given freely rather than taken without permission. It was a beautiful gesture, and one that showed real growth in Rachel's understanding of how relationships should work. I agreed to her request, tucking the ring away in my jewelry box next to George's watch, 2 small objects that represented very different approaches to family, memory, and respect. This small exchange didn't repair our relationship overnight, but it opened a door that I'd thought was permanently closed. Not to the old dynamic where I accepted whatever treatment she chose to give me, but to a new possibility where we could interact as equals, who'd both learned something important about boundaries and accountability. I shared this development with Sarah during one of our regular phone calls, still working through her own process of understanding how badly she'd misjudged the situation with Rachel and my competence to handle my own affairs. I'm proud of you, Sarah said, for standing up to her initially and for being open to her growth now. It would have been easier to just stay angry forever. Anger was useful for a while, I replied. It gave me the energy to fight back when I needed to protect myself, but holding on to it indefinitely would have made me smaller, not larger. What do you mean? I mean that the goal was never to punish Rachel permanently. The goal was to stop letting people take advantage of me and to demand the respect I deserve. Once those goals were achieved, continuing to be angry would have been more about revenge than justice. It was a distinction I'd learned from my volunteer work with other elder abuse victims, the difference between seeking accountability and seeking vengeance. Both were understandable responses to betrayal, but only one led to genuine healing and growth. That conversation with Sarah led to a deeper discussion about family dynamics and how we wanted to relate to each other going forward. She'd been doing her own work since the resolution of the theft charges, examining how her assumptions about aging and competence had contributed to my mistreatment. I realized I was doing something really terrible, she admitted. I was treating your grief like a mental illness, as if being sad about Dad's death meant you couldn't be trusted with basic decisions about your own life. Why do you think you did that? Because it was easier than dealing with my own grief, I think. If you were too fragile to handle details about Dad's belongings, then I didn't have to face how much it hurt to go through his things. I could let Rachel manage all of that and tell myself I was protecting you from additional pain. It was an honest assessment, and one that helped me understand how good intentions could lead to such harmful outcomes. Sarah hadn't set out to dismiss my competence. She'd been trying to shield us both from the emotional difficulty of dealing with George's death directly. But the result was that I lost my voice in decisions about my own husband's belongings, I pointed out. I was cut out of the very process that might have helped me heal. I know, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I chose convenience over respecting your autonomy. These conversations with Sarah were part of the slow work of rebuilding trust and establishing new ways of relating to each other. She was learning to see me as an adult capable of making my own decisions, even painful ones. I was learning to be more direct about my needs and boundaries, instead of assuming that family members would automatically know how to support me. The process wasn't always smooth. There were still moments when Sarah slipped into old patterns of trying to manage my choices, and moments when I had to actively resist the urge to defer to her judgment just to avoid conflict. But we were both committed to doing better, and that commitment made the difficult conversations worthwhile. As the first anniversary of finding George's watch approached, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in my life and my understanding of myself. The frightened, confused woman who'd blamed herself for her husband's missing belongings was gone, replaced by someone more confident and self-aware. I'd learned to paint, joined a book club, and become a volunteer advocate for elder abuse victims. I'd rebuilt relationships with my children on foundations of mutual respect rather than protective condescension. I'd even found a way to respond to Rachel's medical crisis with compassion while maintaining appropriate boundaries. But perhaps most importantly, I'd discovered that it was possible to reinvent yourself at any age, to refuse to be diminished by loss or betrayal or other people's limited expectations of what elderly people were capable of achieving. On the exact anniversary of that day in Rachel's driveway, I did something I'd been planning for months. I drove to the same street where I'd found George's watch and parked in the same spot. But instead of despair and confusion, I felt grateful. Grateful for the crisis that had forced me to discover my own strength. Grateful for the pain that had led to growth. Grateful for the lesson that sometimes our worst experiences become doorways to our best selves. I was wearing George's watch as I did every day now, but I'd also added a small bracelet that Emma had given me for my birthday. A delicate silver chain with a charm that read, "Nevertheless, she persisted." It was a reminder that persistence itself was a form of victory, that refusing to give up on your own worth was sometimes the most radical act possible. That evening, I hosted a small dinner party in my apartment, something I'd never done during my marriage because I'd always been too busy managing everyone else's needs to focus on what I might enjoy. Sarah and Emma came, along with Betty from the Elder Abuse Support Group, Claire from my art class, and 2 other women from my book club. The conversation ranged from books to art to travel plans, to the challenges of aging in a society that often dismisses elderly people's experiences and capabilities. It was exactly the kind of evening I'd dreamed of during those lonely months after George's death. Meaningful connections with people who saw me as Helen first, not just as someone's mother or widow or elderly relative in need of management. As my guests prepared to leave, Emma lingered behind to help with cleanup. She'd grown into a thoughtful young woman over the past year, and our relationship had deepened as she watched me navigate the challenges of standing up for myself and rebuilding my life. "Grandma," she said as we loaded the dishwasher, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret calling the police on Rachel? Do you ever think it would have been easier to just let it go?" It was a profound question from someone her age, and one that deserved a thoughtful answer. I dried my hands and sat down at the kitchen table, gesturing for her to join me. "I think about that sometimes," I said honestly, "especially during the hardest parts of the legal process, when it felt like I was fighting the whole family instead of just standing up for myself. And I've realized that easier isn't always the same as better. It would have been easier to accept being stolen from and lied to. It would have been easier to let everyone keep believing that I was too confused to notice my belongings disappearing, but it wouldn't have been better." Emma nodded, thinking it through. "Because you would have stayed small." "Exactly. Because I would have stayed small and scared and convinced that I deserved whatever treatment people chose to give me." I touched George's watch on my wrist. "Your grandfather always said that standing up for yourself isn't about being aggressive or mean. It's about refusing to make yourself smaller so that other people can feel bigger. Is that what you did? Made yourself smaller?" "For most of my life, yes. I thought that being a good wife and mother meant making everyone else's needs more important than my own, even when those needs involved taking advantage of my generosity or dismissing my feelings. But not anymore." "Not anymore," I agreed. "Now I know that I can be loving and generous and still expect to be treated with respect and honesty. I can care about other people's needs and still take care of my own needs too. Emma helped me finish cleaning up, and as she prepared to leave, she gave me a long hug. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For showing me that it's never too late to find your voice. For proving that being elderly doesn't mean becoming invisible or powerless." She paused. "For teaching me that sometimes the people who love you need to be reminded how to treat you properly." After everyone left, I sat in George's chair with a cup of tea, surrounded by the gentle disorder that comes after hosting friends. Wine glasses in the sink, books pulled out to share favorite passages, the lingering scent of the candle I'd lit for dinner. It was the kind of beautiful mess that comes from real connection, from opening your home and your heart to people who see you and value you for who you are. I thought about George and how proud he would have been to see the life I'd built from the ashes of our marriage. Not a replacement for what we'd had together, but something new and meaningful and authentically mine. He'd always believed I was stronger than I knew, more capable than I gave myself credit for. It had taken his death and Rachel's betrayal to prove him right, but the proof was undeniable now. Looking around my apartment, I could see evidence everywhere of the woman I'd become. George's restored belongings sat comfortably beside my new paintings, books from my book club, and photographs from recent adventures with friends. The space felt alive in ways it hadn't for months after his death, full of past love and present possibility, instead of just empty memories. As I prepared for bed, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. Really looked. Not just the quick glance I'd been giving my reflection since George died. What I saw was someone I barely recognized from 2 years earlier. My posture was straighter, my expression more confident. I'd started wearing colors again, even bought a few new clothes that reflected my personality rather than just my age and economic circumstances. But the biggest change was in my eyes. The lost, frightened look that had haunted them after George's death and during the months of family betrayal was gone, replaced by something clearer and more purposeful. I looked like someone who knew her own worth, someone who expected to be treated with dignity and respect. It had been a long journey from that moment in Rachel's driveway when I'd found George's watch to this evening of friendship and connection in my own home. The path had included police reports and family conflict, legal proceedings and difficult conversations, the slow work of rebuilding trust and establishing new boundaries. But it had also included art classes and volunteer work, book clubs and dinner parties, the daily practice of choosing to become larger rather than smaller in response to life's challenges. It had included learning to carry George's love with me in ways that couldn't be stolen, and discovering that his death had not ended my story, but had opened a new chapter full of possibilities I'd never imagined. As I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, George's watch ticking steadily on the nightstand beside our bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Complete comfort with who I was and excitement about who I was still becoming. Not despite my age, but because of the wisdom and strength that can only come from surviving loss and betrayal and choosing to grow rather than shrink in response. The last thought I had before sleep was a promise to myself and to George's memory. I would never again make myself small to accommodate other people's comfort. I would never again accept being dismissed or exploited or lied to by people who claimed to love me. I had rediscovered my voice, my worth, and my power to shape my own life, and no one would ever take those things from me again. It was a promise I intended to keep for whatever years remained to me, a commitment to living with dignity and purpose, and the kind of fierce self-respect that no one can give you and no one can take away. I had learned, perhaps later than some people but not too late for my own story, that the most important love affair of your life is the one you have with yourself. And finally, after 74 years of life and nearly 2 years of grief and growth, that love affair was just beginning. 3 years have passed since I found George's watch in Rachel's glove compartment, and as I sit here today sharing this story with you, I want you to understand something important. This wasn't just about stolen objects or family betrayal or legal proceedings. This was about something much more fundamental, the right to be seen and respected and valued, regardless of your age or circumstances or vulnerability. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in my story, If you've been made to feel confused or dramatic or unreasonable when you've tried to stand up for yourself, if you've been systematically dismissed or exploited by people who claim to love you, I want you to know that your perceptions are valid, your feelings matter, and you deserve better. It's never too late to find your voice. It's never too late to demand the respect you deserve. It's never too late to choose growth over diminishment, strength over submission, truth over the kind of peace that requires you to make yourself smaller. The watch is still on my wrist as I tell you this story, but what it represents has changed completely. It's no longer just a connection to my late husband's memory, though it remains that, and always will. Now it's also a reminder of my own resilience, a symbol of what's possible when you refuse to accept being treated as less than you are. I think about the woman I was 3 years ago, sitting alone in my apartment, blaming herself for losing track of her husband's belongings, accepting her family's version of her own incompetence. That woman feels like a stranger to me now, someone I knew once, but who no longer exists. In her place is someone who paints watercolors and advocates for elder abuse victims and hosts dinner parties and maintains friendships built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Someone who wears George's watch not as a weight of grief, but as a celebration of love that transcends death and betrayal and all the small meannesses that people inflict on each other. Someone who learned that becoming a widow doesn't mean becoming invisible, that losing a spouse doesn't require losing yourself, that grief can be a doorway to growth if you're willing to walk through it with your dignity intact. Have you ever felt like your family saw you more as a resource to manage than as a person to respect? Have you ever been made to doubt your own memories, your own perceptions, your own worth? Have you ever accepted treatment that you knew was wrong because challenging it seemed harder than enduring it? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this narrative touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own strength or gave you hope for your own transformation, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Sharing these truths helps them reach the people who most need to hear them, and sometimes that's the difference between someone staying lost and someone finding their way home to themselves. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for witnessing this journey from victim to survivor, to someone who helps other people find their own voices. And remember, it's never too late to reclaim your power, your dignity, and your right to be treated with the love and respect that every person deserves. Your story isn't over. In fact, it might just be beginning.